This man spied for George Washington and helped win the American Revolution. As his reward, he was sent back into slavery. His intelligence reports were so accurate, so perfectly timed, that the Marquis de Lafayette himself credited them with making the victory at Yorktown possible. The victory that ended the Revolutionary War. The victory that created the United States. His name was James Armistead. He was born into slavery in Virginia. He walked into the British camp alone, unarmed, with no government protection and no promise of freedom, just courage and a mission. When the war ended and America celebrated its liberty, James Armistead was returned to his enslaver. The country he had risked his life to create did not consider him a citizen, did not consider him free, did not consider him, under its own laws, a full human being. This is his story, one of the most important and most buried stories in American history, and it deserves to be told at full volume. Virginia, 1748. James Armistead is born into slavery on a plantation in New Kent County, the property of William Armistead, a Virginia planter. From the moment of his birth, he is legally owned. His labor, his children, his future, all belong to someone else. He grows up in colonial Virginia, a society of extraordinary contradiction. The same men who wrote "All men are created equal" also held other human beings as property. This contradiction is not background noise. It is the central fact of James Armistead's entire existence. In 1781, James Armistead is around 30 years old. The Revolutionary War has been grinding on for 6 years. The British have moved aggressively into the South. Virginia is under direct threat. The Marquis de Lafayette, the young French general fighting for the American cause, is commanding the defense of Virginia. Lafayette is 23 years old, brilliant, idealistic, and badly outmatched. Opposing him, General Charles Cornwallis, the finest British commander in America, with a larger and better equipped force. Lafayette needs intelligence. He needs to know where Cornwallis is moving, what his plans are, and when. James Armistead volunteers. He asks his enslaver, William Armistead, for permission to serve under Lafayette. Permission is granted. He walks into Lafayette's camp. He presents himself. He offers to go behind British lines. Lafayette accepts. What he could not have fully understood at the time was that he had just recruited one of the most remarkable intelligence assets of the entire war. James Armistead was the ideal spy for this mission for reasons that reflected the brutal logic of the time. In a society where black men were invisible to white authority, overlooked, underestimated, assumed to be present only as servants, he could move through the British camp without suspicion. His invisibility was his weapon. He walked into the British camp and presented himself as a runaway enslaved man seeking shelter with the Crown. The British believed him immediately, because the British were actively recruiting enslaved people who escaped from American Patriots, offering them freedom in exchange for service. Lord Dunmore's proclamation of 1775 had promised freedom to any enslaved person who escaped a Patriot enslaver and joined British forces. The British lines were full of black men who had taken that offer. James Armistead joined them, and nobody suspected he was working for the other side. He made himself useful. He served food. He cleaned boots. He carried messages. He was present at meals, at meetings, at casual conversations between British officers who spoke freely in front of the servants, because servants, they believed, did not matter and did not understand. They were wrong. James Armistead understood everything. He listened. He remembered. He recorded. He was present when Cornwallis discussed troop movements, when officers debated strategy over dinner, when plans were made for the positioning of forces across the Virginia campaign. He heard it all, and he passed it all back to Lafayette through a carefully maintained chain of intermediaries. But James Armistead went further. Cornwallis was also looking for a spy inside the American camp, someone who could tell him Lafayette's plans and positions. He recruited James Armistead for the job. James Armistead became a double agent. He carried false information to Cornwallis, reports carefully constructed with Lafayette to mislead the British about American strength, positioning, and intentions. Cornwallis received the reports, believed them, and made decisions based on them. Decisions that would eventually prove catastrophic. The intelligence James Armistead provided gave Lafayette a precise picture of Cornwallis's forces, their numbers, their supply situation, the location of their positions, and crucially, The fact that Cornwallis intended to fortify and hold the Virginia port of Yorktown. Yorktown. That word, that location, would become the turning point of the entire war. And James Armistead, servant at a British dinner table, was the man who told the Americans where to look. Consider what this required. Every day in that camp was a performance, smiling, deferring, being invisible on purpose, while carrying information that could get him killed. Discovery meant not just death. It meant something worse, being publicly tortured and executed as a traitor, while the men who sent him into that camp carried none of the risk. October 1781. Washington and his French allies, guided by exactly the kind of intelligence James Armistead had provided, converged on Yorktown. The British, expecting American forces to be weaker and further away than they were, found themselves surrounded on land and blockaded by a French fleet at sea. Cornwallis had trusted the intelligence reports he'd received from his spy inside the American camp. Those reports were the false information James Armistead had been feeding him, designed to keep him in place, confident and unprepared, while the trap was being built around him. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. It was the decisive battle of the Revolutionary War. The British would continue to negotiate for 2 more years, but Yorktown effectively ended the conflict. The United States of America, the dream of it, the reality of it, became possible in large part because of what happened in the preceding months. Lafayette wrote directly about James Armistead's role. In a certificate he gave him, one of the only documentary records of his service, Lafayette stated that James Armistead rendered essential services to me, and that his work had been industriously collected and most faithfully delivered. High praise in formal 18th century language for intelligence that changed a war. The certificate was more than praise. It was evidence. It was the only thing James Armistead would have to show for everything he had done. Because when the war ended and the celebrations began, he went back to something that had not changed at all. He went back to slavery. The act passed by the Virginia legislature in 1783 to free enslaved men who had served in the military did not apply to spies. James Armistead had served as an intelligence operative, not a soldier. The technical distinction, a bureaucratic boundary drawn by men who wrote the rules, meant his service did not qualify him for freedom. While veterans were celebrated, while Washington gave speeches about liberty, while the men who had served in the Continental Army were recognized for their contributions, James Armistead returned to the plantation in New Kent County and resumed his life as the legal property of William Armistead. Let that sit for a moment. He had infiltrated the enemy camp. He had provided the intelligence that helped lead to the decisive victory of the war. He had placed himself at mortal risk, alone behind enemy lines, with no protection from any government. And when it was over, he was a slave again. The country he had helped create, the country whose founding document declared that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights, did not include him in that declaration. He knew it. He had always known it. He volunteered anyway. In 1784, James Armistead petitioned the Virginia legislature for his freedom. His petition described his service. It described his contributions. It asked for the same recognition that had been given to other veterans. The legislature debated it, and then they declined. It was Lafayette who intervened. The Marquis de Lafayette, the French general, the foreign ally, wrote a formal letter supporting James Armistead's petition. He used the certificate he had given him. He used his own prestige, his own reputation, his own political standing to argue for the freedom of the man who had served him. The French general made the argument that American lawmakers had failed to make, that a man who had risked his life for American independence deserved to live as a free man in the country his courage had helped create. In 1787, 4 years after the war ended, 6 years after Yorktown, the Virginia General Assembly passed a special act granting James Armistead his freedom. He was the only person freed by that specific act. It required an act of government to release one man from slavery for services rendered to the nation he had saved. Upon receiving his freedom, James Armistead took a new name. He called himself James Armistead Lafayette. He took the name of the French general, not the American government, not George Washington, who had advocated for him. The name was a statement, an acknowledgement of who had actually kept his promise. He bought land in Virginia. He farmed. He married. He raised a family. He lived as a free man, but in a country that still enslaved millions, in a state where his children could be returned to bondage under the wrong circumstances. Freedom, in 1787 Virginia, was a fragile and qualified thing. In 1824, 43 years after Yorktown, the Marquis de Lafayette returned to America for a triumphal tour. He was received as a hero, the last surviving general of the Revolutionary War, beloved by a nation that had not forgotten his contribution. Enormous crowds, parades, celebrations. James Lafayette, now in his early 70s, traveled to meet him. When Lafayette saw the old man in the crowd, he recognized him. He stepped forward. He embraced him. In front of a large crowd of Americans, the French general embraced the formerly enslaved spy who had made Yorktown possible. A portrait was painted of James Lafayette later, attributed to John Blennerhassett Martin, one of the only portraits of any Revolutionary War spy painted from life. He sits with dignity, looking directly at the viewer. He wears plain clothes. His expression is composed and private. He looks like what he was, a man who had seen things. James Lafayette died in 1830. He was in his early 80s. He is buried in Virginia. For most of American history, his name did not appear in the standard accounts of the Revolutionary War. He was a footnote when he was mentioned at all. The history of the Revolutionary War, as it was taught for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, was a history of white men of property whose contributions were documented, celebrated, and endlessly retold. James Lafayette's contribution was documented by Lafayette himself, and then largely ignored. It is only in recent decades, through the work of historians, educators, and documentary filmmakers, that James Lafayette's story has begun to receive the attention it deserves. A story that is not a footnote, a story that is, in some ways, the whole story. The story of America has always been the story of people whose contributions were essential and whose recognition was denied. James Lafayette is not the exception to American history. He is a clear-eyed view of what American history actually contains. His intelligence changed the outcome of the war. His service was not paid. His freedom was delayed by bureaucratic technicality. His name was nearly erased, and the country he helped create debated for another 78 years after his death whether people like him were people at all. The American Revolution created the most influential political document in modern history. It set out principles, liberty, equality, rights, that have shaped the world for 250 years. It was also built in part by people who were never included in those principles. That is not a contradiction that diminishes the principles. It is a challenge to live up to them more fully. James Lafayette knew the principles didn't include him. He volunteered anyway. He walked into the enemy camp anyway. He risked his life for a country that would not recognize his humanity anyway. And that choice, made freely, made bravely, made with full knowledge of its likely reward, is one of the most profound acts of faith in American history. His portrait hangs in the Valentine Museum in Richmond, Virginia. If you go there, you can look at his face. You can look at the man who sat at British dinner tables and heard things that changed the war. You can look at the man who was sent back into slavery afterward. You can look at him and ask him why he did it. He cannot answer you. But the question he leaves for us, across nearly 250 years of American history, is the one that still matters. If a man can risk his life for a country that doesn't call him free, what is that country obligated to become? Tell us what you think in the comments.